Senator.
I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this debate. I think it's important for Canadians to try and understand what is happening with respect to where we are on this bill. It's a bill that began in the Senate, where there were significant concerns raised by Senators Hubley and Senator Dallaire. It went to committee, where a number of witnesses appeared who discussed the reason why this bill, which should ordinarily be a matter of simple ratification by this House, because we as a House have expressed our views on cluster bombs for a long period of time. I can recall asking a minister several years ago, the former minister David Emerson, about what role was Canada going to be playing in the implementation of the law on cluster munitions. Canada was not that active in putting the bill forward. Finally agreed that we would join in the ratification and would participate in the ratification. And essentially this law is one that is supposed to put into effect an international treaty that has been signed by Canada as well as a number of other countries. And my colleagues who have spoken before have discussed how it is that this bill has so imperfectly reflected the treaty which we have signed. Mr. Speaker, cluster bombs are being banned in this treaty. The use of them is being banned in this treaty. Something which Canada has agreed to do on its own unilaterally over a long period of time, that is not in dispute. No one is saying that the government opposite is continuing to promote the use of cluster bombs or is somehow going against the treaty that it has signed. However, what we are saying for our part, and we will be supporting the legislation going forward to committee, but what we are saying as clearly as we can is that the way in which this government has chosen to implement the treaty is contentious. And when I say that, Mr. Speaker, it has to be understood that any number of countries have already had their internal debates, their parliamentary approval, and if every other country in their own legislation had somehow adopted exactly the same interpretation of the treaty as the government, then our case would obviously be substantially weakened. But what we find, Mr. Speaker, and again, one almost is baffled by the approach that the Conservatives have taken. The person who negotiated the treaty, Mr. Turcotte, said that he was profoundly disappointed in the interpretation on the treaty put by the government. As my colleague who's already spoken from the New Democratic Party, comme elle a dit, le Premier ministre de l'Australie était vraiment déçu et même, je dirais, fâché avec l'approche du gouvernement du Canada. C'est Malcolm Fraser, c'est un ancien Premier ministre conservateur de l'Australie, pas un homme radical, pas un homme de la gauche, pas un homme qui est contre la protection de la souveraineté de son pays par des forces militaires, au contraire. Mais je pense que c'est vraiment remarquable qu'on voit que le seul pays qui a pris une telle position de l'interprétation de la traité que nous avons signé, c'est le gouvernement conservateur devant nous. Et nous posons naturellement des questions. Pourquoi est-ce que le gouvernement a choisi, dans la section 11 de notre loi qui est devant nous, une interprétation si négative de la traité qu'il est possible de dire, comme a dit mon collègue d'Ottawa Centre, qu'une des conséquences de la loi maintenant proposée par les conservateurs, c'est que c'est possible que les officiers canadiens pourraient exiger l'utilisation de ces bombes, que les soldats canadiens pourraient être exigés d'utiliser ces bombes. Et pour moi, ça pose une contradiction totale de la réalité que le Canada est contre l'utilisation de ces bombes. Alors, Monsieur le Président, on a un bon problème. Les conservateurs ont réussi à créer un problème, même quand ils sont en faveur du désarmement multilatéral, en ce qui concerne l'utilisation de ces bombes si dangereuses et si cruelles dans leurs effets sur la population civile. Mr. Speaker, I think we've all realized in the last few years that wars increasingly involve civilian populations, that wars are no longer armed combats between soldiers lining up in a line one against the other, but wars increasingly involve overwhelmingly the civilian population of countries around the world. The human experience has been, whether it's landmines or whether it's cluster bombs, that these are weapons that have a horrible effect and a horrible impact on the civilian population. They're hard to target, they're hard to control, it's hard to say who exactly is going to be hit, who is going to be hurt, and who is going to be killed. And it's the indiscriminate nature of these bombs that has led the world to say, actually, we're going to stop the use of these bombs. We're going to stop the manufacture of these bombs, and we're going to stop their use. And for our part, we're completely in favor of the legislation from the perspective of wanting to implement the treaty. But where we insist that changes need to be made in committee in order to respect not only the spirit, but actually the letter of the treaty which we're signing, has to do with changes that are required to Section 11. Now, I know, Mr. Speaker, that my colleagues, Senators Hubley and Dallaire, two people of great integrity and great ability, who've been watching and spotting and debating this bill in the other place, have done their best to convince the Conservative majority in the Senate that changes needed to be made, and those changes, unfortunately, were not made. But let's look at the numbers of countries, Mr. Speaker, that have explicitly rejected the interpretation of this treaty that is being put on it by this government. At least 35 states have articulated support for the clear interpretation that the interoperability clause is not an escape clause. That's the clause that the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Defence was just talking about. New Zealand's legislation does not create any exceptions to the Convention's prohibitions. Norway has noted that, quote, the exemption for military cooperation does not authorize state parties to engage in activities prohibited by the Convention. 10 other NATO members have issued similar interpretations: Belgium, Bulgaria, Croatia, the Czech Republic, France, Germany, Hungary, Iceland, Portugal, and Slovenia. Mr. Speaker, it's hard for the government to argue that in order for us to be able to participate in NATO operations or in joint operations with other countries, that we're somehow going to be able to use the interoperability clause as a pure and simple escape clause. And that's actually what this government has done. What this government has done is taken this concept of interoperability, which is a principle that one has to have a close look at with respect to how Canadian troops, in fact, are working and are exercising their responsibilities and are, in fact, engaging in combat in other countries. And it's important at the same time for us to say, well, what is the point of Canada saying we're going to sign a convention and we're going to agree to a treaty, but we're not actually going to implement that treaty if it affects any of the operations which we're undertaking anywhere in the world? it almost seems like an expression on the part of the government of a kind of an organized hypocrisy, where out of one side of your mouth you say, yes, we are going to be eliminating the use of cluster bombs, and then you say, but no, not necessarily, if it means that we have to agree to the rejection of their use while we're actually in combat. And I think this is a challenge, Mr. Speaker, that Canadians need to understand and the government needs to come clean on. I appreciate the fact that the government has introduced the legislation, that the government is referring it to committee, and that the government says that its intent is to implement a treaty which we are signing as a sovereign country. But I think it's beholden, the government cannot do that and at the same time turn around and say, yes, we are going to implement the treaty, but we're going to make sure that when we're in actual conditions of combat, it's not going to have any effect. I think this is really a contradictory position that the government is taking. And once again, they've taken the position of, if you like, Canadian exceptionalism to a degree that makes us almost a laughingstock of the rest of the world. The government effectively is saying, yes, we want to pretend to be the good guys that are going along with signing and ratifying this treaty, but no, we don't disagree really with those of our partners, the United States and elsewhere, who in fact are not going to sign this treaty because the United States says, well, we don't want to use these, but there may be circumstances in which we have no choice but to use them, and we're not going to bind the hands of our troops. And let us remember, Mr. Speaker, that the United States also refused to sign the Landmines Treaty. So it seems to me, Mr. Speaker, the government has to come clean. Is it or is it not the intention of the Government of Canada to allow its troops to be actively engaged in using cluster bombs while in combat? Yes or no? Is it in fact the case that the Government of Canada intends its commanding officers to authorize the use of these cluster bombs while they are actually on the field of combat, even though it is Canada that has signed a treaty saying these will not be used? It seems to me there has to be some consistency. And they have in fact done exactly what other countries have warned us against doing, and they have done exactly what other countries have refused to do. And that is to use this notion of interoperability as an actual escape from the responsibilities that we have to implement the legislation. And that's why I think we need to go back into committee, Mr. Speaker. We need to call Mr. Turcotte. We need to call the people who've interpreted this legislation. We need to call the people who've been looking hard at it. We need to call people from other countries who have an understanding as to how they have interpreted this. And we need to have a real discussion in committee as to why this government would have taken such an approach to this legislation. Canada should not be escaping its responsibilities by choosing to implement a treaty in this particular way. It makes a mockery of our commitment. It makes a mockery of our understanding of what it means to actually put into effect and to put into operation a treaty obligation that we've signed. And it's going to provide for total confusion with respect to what it is that Canada and Canadian troops have actually agreed to do. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, while we support this bill going on to committee, we have great difficulty with the way in which this government has chosen to interpret the treaty in Section 11 of this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.